Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. It's appropriate because I'm part of the Pro-Democracy Coalition. That's what I've been thinking of it as. It's a pretty broad coalition as we're learning more and more. But the Democracy Group is a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And we are on Patreon. If you've been listening to the show for a little while, you've been hearing and very excited about it. Joining Patreon, it really does help us out. It helps us continue to bring these interviews and these conversations to you. It also gives you access to this moderated community that we have. We'll be doing more chats on there. You can talk with me. I'll be having others that have been on this program that you can speak with. And at higher levels, you'll gain access to TP&R merch. Gotta love the merch. You'll get ad-free episodes and the ability to give input, perhaps even receive director credits on upcoming episodes. Just go to patreon.com/politicsandreligion. That's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. And as always, I gotta say this, but reviews. It would be a huge favor. It really would. I love to hear from folks, but it really does help us in the rankings. That's the one thing that's holding us back. We have dozens, over 100 actually, 126 reviews just on Apple, but we could use more because that's the one thing that's lagging behind in terms of our rankings. It would definitely put us into the top 100 if we had more reviews. So I ask you, as a favor to me, to go ahead and do that. If you've done it already, create another account and do it again. And I put links to the Patreon and it's an easy link that brings you right to a way to write reviews. It's all in our show notes, and it helps so we can continue having these great conversations like the one I'm really excited to have, fella I've been wanting to have on this show for a long time, named Tom Nichols. Tom Nichols is a staff writer at The Atlantic and is a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, where he taught for 25 years, and an instructor at the Harvard Extension School. He has served as a legislative aide in the Massachusetts House and the U.S. Senate. He writes about international security, Russia, and the challenges to democracy in the United States and around the world, and is a self-described curmudgeon, cat guy, and defender of experts. His books include The Death of Expertise and Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. He is also a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. So who is Tom Nichols? Just kidding. Thanks for joining us. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
You bet. There's not much going on in the news, so I thought we'd just talk a little bit about your background. No, actually, I did want to kind of I did want to touch upon a little bit about your background. You shared a lot about your upbringing in a working class family, in a working class town, but you went on to get a master's from Columbia, a PhD from Georgetown. I was curious what people like Mr. Lapete, is that how you say his name? Lapete?
Lapete, the guy. Yeah, the guy I almost got caught stealing from. Yeah.
That's right. And Mr. Knightley.
God rest his soul.
Yeah. What would guys like that, or guys that you grew up with, that you rode your bikes to those guys' stores? What did they think when you started pursuing upper level degrees and a career in academia?
It's such a great question because I can tell you that I was a troublemaker and I had a unstable home. I mean, from the outside, we looked like, basic 2-parent family, but we had a lot of troubles. My mom struggled with alcoholism, and my parents split up and got back together. And even though I have four half siblings, they were much older than I was. They were all gone from other marriages. So I was basically an only child left unsupervised a lot. And so I was smart, but a smart ass. Prone to trouble. I ran with a pack of boys. Not always, a lot of them, so I was related to some of them, some were just friends, but we knew how to find trouble. And I think if you ask people I grew up with, Mr. Lapete, Mr. Knightley, my teachers, they'd say, we always knew he was a smart kid capable of doing some really good things. We're just glad to see that he didn't end up in jail. I think they would tell you. I mean, they I mean, I can remember being in junior high school and saying, guys like me don't go to college,
Yeah.
to my guidance counselor, you're a smart kid. You could tell them, like, I'm not going to, people like me don't go to college. Don't be an idiot.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of them, in fact, I did call that counselor, I will say, when I got 35 years ago, when I got my fellowship to Georgetown, I called him up and I said, listen, you were right. I figured I owed him that because I put him through enough gray hair. And he said, I knew that you could do it. He said, just a matter of, whether you're going to make it that far.
Do you think
that's what they tell you?
Do you think that there were certain bridges or crossroads that you came to that it could have gone either way, or was it a whole series of things?
Well, both. There were big influences that I was really fortunate to have. I will say that my father, not going to win any Father of the Year awards, but he had this very strong sense of duty that he felt like I will say this. My father told me when I was in my late 20s, he said, I was going to marry your mother long enough to give you a name, and then I was going to scram.
Oh, wow.
And just go.
Wow.
Yeah. And instead he stayed and he said, food on the table, roof over your head, clothes on your back had to be done. That's what a father does. And he loved me. I was his youngest and I was his, I think my oldest brother, half brother would tell you I was his favorite. But also, it was brutal. I mean, he didn't want to be married to my mother. He felt trapped. And yet they stayed married for 40 years. Toward the end, when she died, he was inconsolable.
Oh, wow.
But when I was a small kid, it was really touch and go. So I had a dad who said, no matter how angry I am about what happened, you're always going to have a roof over your head and food on the table in front of you. That counts for a lot because it's a good example to a young boy. And he did love me. And I mean, I knew that. He told me that. And so, even if your father's kind of nuts sometimes, knowing that he's there. I also had a very good church community. I grew up in the Greek Orthodox Church. To this day, the priest I grew up with refers to me and the other kids that around me, the other guys. He said, "You were my boys." Like he was a surrogate father, and he would. I remember that when he was mad at us in Greek school, he would throw this giant ring of keys at us and scare the crap out of us. Like we'd be sitting there talking, and all of a sudden, this like meteor of keys would go bang onto the table, And so he was a disciplinarian, but a very loving guy. My mother loved me unconditionally, but struggled. And so I had this kind of I had the most important things that will get a kid through that, which is I had church, I had some family, and some native smarts. And I had a couple of teachers. I had a lot of trouble in school, but I had a couple of teachers who kind of, looked out for me, especially once I got to high school.
Yeah.
It could have gone very wrong because I was hanging around places. I mean, had I been arrested, there was a couple of nights I used to hang around a place where there was this big bonfire with bikers. I was like 15.
Yeah.
And there was heroin dealing going on. I mean, I could have, if the cops had raided that place, it could have messed up my life, especially since one of the cops could have been my older half brother.
Oh, wow.
I could have been busted by my own brother, which would have ruined Christmas.
Would have made Thanksgiving a little awkward.
Things were a little tense around the holidays. And there were just, I mean, it was the 70s. And for people, you know, I'm sure we'll get to politics at some point, but people keep talking about J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. The book that I read that made more sense to me was a book called Townie by Andre Dubus, who grew up in the 70s in a Massachusetts factory town the way I did. And, it was gritty, and there were plenty of opportunities to get in trouble. And there were plenty of opportunities to get girls in trouble, which happened to a lot of guys that I grew up with in the
Yeah.
70s. I mean, there were just so many ways to wreck your life by just, switching from one lane to the other. And I came really close to all of those. So I'm really grateful that I just had some, I had some lucky breaks. I had some friends. I had people who looked out for me. But there were plenty of places where things could have really gone wrong.
Yeah. Now, you touched a little bit upon the church, your upbringing in the church. I've
Mhm.
heard you refer to yourself as an Orthodox Christian. And what I'm realizing, and I should have thought about this, is that you're probably capital O Orthodox.
Right.
But I've
Eastern
always,
Orthodox, Greek Orthodox.
yeah, but
Yeah.
sometimes when you
The big,
have,
the big stovepipe hats,
yeah,
black robes, smells and bells,
yeah.
old
I
school.
always thought of it as little o Orthodox because maybe some of your theology is, but I guess I was wrong about that, huh?
Yeah, no, the Orthodox, there aren't that many of us. I mean, we're a religious minority in America. There's like a million or so of us here in North America. But if you have friends who are Greek or Serbian or Russian, they're probably Orthodox.
Yeah.
Um, and for those, I guess for people who don't understand the Orthodox Church, we are the pre-schismatic church, that 11th century, we in the Catholic Church go our separate ways. And then, of course, the Catholics have the Reformation and the whole Protestant, stuff that for us is like 3 steps removed down the line. And so, yeah, there were when I grew up, there were 3 or 4 Orthodox churches within a drive of us. Mine was in walking distance. It was actually founded in part by my grandfather, who was an immigrant,
Oh, wow.
which is how they did it, right?
Yeah.
Immigrants came over and they pooled their money and they rented a place until they could put enough money aside to build a church, as other immigrant communities did. And
Yeah.
so so I was fortunate that I grew up in that tradition, sort of old school, but not no, but not little o Orthodox of,
Okay.
like like hardcore Protestant evangelical or Amish or something like that. It's the old European, Greek, Russian, Serbian, Antiochian church from the old country.
Yeah. So you've continued your religious practice into your adulthood. Would you say that your religious practice helps you to form theological perspectives? Or are you keeping philosophical, theological views and then your political views? Are you keeping that somewhat separate from your traditional religious practice?
Again, such an interesting question. The Orthodox Church is not, it's hierarchical. I mean, maybe I'll try and compare this at first to the Catholics, a church people understand better, right? They have a pope establishes doctrine, College of Cardinals, all that stuff. The Orthodox Church has a patriarch, and there are, statements from the patriarch, but Orthodoxy is very much organized on a kind of parish principle, where most things you simply work out with your parish priest,
Okay.
with the guidance of the church. And so I have never been a deep theological thinker.
Interesting.
Maybe because my religion hasn't required me to be one. I mean, it's a rich tradition, and my priest growing up had a doctorate in theology, so I was always trying to play stump the chump, with the priest, because he had a doctorate. I was like, Father, it was like George Carlin
Yeah.
and his old bit, Father, if you're supposed to take communion every day, but then you're on a boat that goes over the international date line,
That's
but
good stuff. Well,
um,
let me ask you a little bit more head on
I
about
didn't.
your. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. Well, what I was going to say was that I didn't. I haven't spent a lot of time trying to marry what I believe as an Orthodox Christian to my politics, because my religion, I asked a priest about this once, and he said, look, the Orthodox Church doesn't spend a lot of time, preaching politics from the pulpit, because they assume that if you are raised in the Orthodox faith, you're going to make good decisions everywhere else in your life.
Mm.
You see what I'm saying? So
it's about character formation.
yeah, well, it's about faith in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And salvation, but that that politics, the Orthodox Church more than most, and I'm not speaking for the Orthodox Church, I can feel like my Archbishop looking over my shoulder. I'm not speaking for the church, but I think the Orthodox Church has always been less infused into daily political stuff, because I think it's a religion that treats politics as there's always politics, there's always terrible things happening, there are always hot button issues of the day, and so the church, and it doesn't have to weigh in on every single one of them every day and say your position on House Bill 476 on casino gambling should be, instead they say the Orthodox Church frowns on games of chance. Okay, that I will admit that hasn't stopped me.
I'm not a gambler. I'm a measured risk taker.
Right. So I think it's just a different approach than I think you'd find among hardcore Catholics, and certainly among evangelicals, who reject any kind of hierarchy in that sense of what the church, like the Bible says what it says, right? Not what the church fathers think it said.
Right.
And so it's just different in that sense. But it's also, it's important to me in the sense that I don't feel like I have this constant balancing act between what I believe. I mean, when I recite the creed every Sunday, like most Christians, right? I believe in one God, Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and so on. I don't say, now how does that inform my politics? I don't think that's,
yeah.
I think that way, I think that's a way to get into a lot of trouble, because you will inevitably start conforming your religion to your politics instead of your politics to your religion.
Unless you're a pain in the ass troublemaker like me, then I get into trouble because I'm reading my Bible really closely. But when I go to church, a lot of guys I go to church with start with their political preferences or prejudices and back little shards of scripture into it. So, but that's just
Homer Simpson. Every time that happens, I have a very close Orthodox friend, and we kind of laugh about that, because it's like that great line from The Simpsons, where one of the kids says the Bible says something, and Homer says, well, the Bible says a lot of things.
That's right.
And
that's right.
I think people doing that is, again, it becomes, as you just pointed out, it becomes dangerous. It becomes this kind of cherry picking exercise.
Yeah, absolutely.
Say, well, I have these prejudices and political views because it says right here in, in 2 Corinthians.
2 Corinthians, right? Right. Well, let me ask you one more kind of table setter political philosophy. Jumping over to the political framework, and then we'll get into some of the topical stuff, some of your more recent writing. I'd love to hear your take on the difference between someone who, I think, as you describe yourself, temperamentally and philosophically conservative versus what the Republican Party stands for today.
Well, I think temperamentally conservative means prudential, incremental. This is part of why real conservative, true conservatives, I don't know, that always gets into trouble. I'm the real conservative. But people who have a temperamentally conservative personality drive progressives crazy, right? Because we're the people who say, go slow, one slice at a time, 1 foot in front of the other. And progressives are the people who say, revolution now, change it all fast. And, waiting is for cowards. I think conservatives also have, and again, I'm mostly trying to draw this as a, not a parallel, but as a distinction from progressives, from people on the right versus people on the left. I think conservatives have a much more fixed view of human nature. I think people on the left think human nature is malleable, that institutions can create new people and change them over time. Whereas I think conservatives start from People are just the great line in the original Superman where Lex Luthor says, "Son, people are no damn good," and you sort of start from that very conservative pessimism to say you need, that's why we institute government. Government is there to keep us from hurting each other and to advance certain projects we need done. It's not there to be our teacher. It's not there to form us in the way that people on the left would say. And I think also conservatives, if progressives are about the future, and I respect them for that, because things do have to change. Things inevitably change, and change has to happen. Conservatives, nonetheless, I think we look back a little more and say, okay, but let's not throw out all tradition. Let's recognize in the past what was good that we should conserve and keep, instead of simply saying the past is always bad, the future is always better. Never look at the road behind you, only look at the road ahead of you. Conservatives, I think, are better about rooting politics in an ongoing historical sense, rather than simply saying that everything that came before me is needs to be fixed. And I'm like that even in my when I spent 25 years working for the Navy, and it used to drive me crazy every time an admiral would walk in and say, "You're all doing a great job. Now let's change everything." Inherently, I am conservative. New admiral would come in, I would say, my gut was always wanting to say to this new boss, this new 2 or 3 star come in, I'd say, listen, take it easy, learn what's going on, don't try and change everything tomorrow. And that's not how American management is anymore. Americans walk in and say, change agents, right? We, even in our language, I'm a change agent.
Right.
I'm not. I'm an inertia agent.
So is there more room in a broad pro-democracy coalition that includes today's Democratic Party? Or do you think there's a time in the near future where the Republican Party can have room for what you're describing, somebody who's temperamentally, philosophically conservative?
No, I think the Republican Party's dead. I think America needs a new center-right party. I think you can't run a democracy without a party of the right and of the left, because I think they check each other's worst excesses.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's room. I mean, the Republican Party has become a cult of personality.
Yeah.
There is no, it's not really I think it's important to point out, excuse me, that the Republican Party isn't really a political party.
Right.
In the sense that we would understand that. It's not like an association of people with policy views where they're taking them all to a party organization and then trying to mediate them to create policy to move forward as a political organization. It's a bunch of people rallying around a celebrity and whatever. I mean, in 2020, the Republican Party didn't even have a platform.
Right. Yeah.
They just said whatever the boss says. That's not a party. I do think there's room in the pro-democracy coalition to, I think it's actually been helpful for a Democratic Party that I think had gone off the rails about a lot of things. Remember, the Democrats were a national minority by 2016. But every time Democrats say, well, why should we listen to you former Republicans? I'm like, you might want to listen to the people that had reduced you to a governing minority across the country. You'd lost the House, the Senate, the White House, most governors' mansions, most elected seats. And I think leavening that with a little bit of sensible advice from people who, are to the right of people to the left, I think is how you get a much more effective party and government and movement. So I'm hoping that holds at least for another year or so, and then we go back to fighting about tax rates and
foreign policy and So I was reminded this morning. I was reminded this morning. My initial reaction, I have to admit, was just utter disappointment. I mean, okay.
About Tim Walz?
Well, okay, let me back up for a second. It was just my initial reaction because I grew up very observantly Jewish before I became a Christian, but I'm still Jewish. I'm still Jewish at my core. I have family in Israel. So what's been happening over the last year, I've been processing through a different lens. different heart, a different soul, a different mind. I'm still Jewish at my core, right? So my initial reaction was, they did it to us again, you know? But now that said, okay, let me just,
Okay, but I'm just curious. I mean, because
yeah.
of Vance's positions on Israel and Gaza and
Well, Shapiro or Walz?
Waltz.
So I haven't looked at Walz. I know Walz's background, and if I'm being objective, separate the whole how this last weekend in particular played out with Shapiro. If I
Mhm.
separate that out, I look at Walz and I think, oh, I like this guy's background. I can get on board with it. He's Army National Guard for a couple dozen years. He
Oh, I see what you're saying. So, like, you're arguing that, or your feeling was they took a Jewish guy and they just pushed him out of the way because he's Jewish.
Yeah, and I retain very, very close, dear friends that were in fact on Columbia's campus protesting pro Palestine, you know, in favor of Palestinian citizens, what have you. And I'm not going to say that those friends are necessarily anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic hatred, but it's adjacent to that, and I've had to endure that. And it's taken a lot for me to.
I don't know about your friends, but some of them were.
So, some of them absolutely were. I wouldn't say that my friends were, because I understand their thinking and their sympathies with people on the ground in Gaza. I understand that. I understand. I'm also a harsh critic, as Shapiro was, of Netanyahu. And I think Shapiro referred to him as the worst prime minister in Israel's history, which I tend to agree with. And half of my cousins agree with that. My Israeli cousins agree with that. But when I started seeing, I think it was Thursday or Friday, one of my friends pulled out a college essay that Shapiro wrote, arguing against the two-state solution. And then I don't have a great deal of patience for it, given the context of the last year. So it's been a hard pill for me to swallow.
Let me suggest something then. Looking at this as again, part of I'm not a Democrat. Looking at this as part of this pro-democracy coalition, hoping that Harris can actually defeat Trump and
Absolutely, yeah.
prevent him from the White House. Everything, this whole discussion that we're having about Shapiro and papers that he wrote in college and what he said about Netanyahu, these are all the best arguments for not choosing him.
Wait, why do you say that?
Because those are distractions in a race that is going to turn on winning 4 or 5 swing states.
But the most important state is Pennsylvania, and he was a slam dunk to push Pennsylvania over the line.
But that's a different question. If you're arguing that he could have won Pennsylvania simply by like choosing him because he's the governor of Pennsylvania, that's the strongest argument, and something that will come out later. I don't know when this comes out, but by the time this airs, something that I will have written. That was the best argument. But if Shapiro can win Pennsylvania for Harris while he's there as the governor, putting him on the ticket doesn't make a lot of sense, because then he just becomes a lightning rod for all of the discussion that we're having now, that he becomes a lightning rod for his Jewishness, for his beliefs about Israel. And this, vice presidents, the first rule of a vice presidential nominee is do no harm.
Yeah.
Don't be a distraction from the campaign. If this campaign ends up about being whether Josh Shapiro is, sufficiently pro-Israel, then you've really made a terrible strategic mistake, because the election should be about how dangerous Donald Trump is and how this is a coalition of perfectly normal people trying to prevent the government from falling into the hands of a would-be autocrat. And I think that that's probably, it's the same argument, by the way, that I had with people about very online argument about Pete Buttigieg. Like, why would you pick a guy whose sexuality is going to become the lightning rod that drowns out a whole bunch of other things, especially when he has no electoral experience, hasn't ever won a statewide election, has never won a national office? Do no harm. Pick the guy that's going to make your case. Bring some votes with him from a region you might need. I mean, the fact that Waltz, I keep saying Waltz, it's Walz.
Walz, yeah.
That Walz is, next door to Wisconsin and Michigan. That's an important thing. That in that sense, he makes a lot of sense to me. And while I was very, like you, I was, kind of swayed by boy, wouldn't it be great to just lock down Pennsylvania and take that piece off the board? there was a part of me that said, boy, the price you could pay in terms of just noise. Because
Yeah.
remember, the Republicans are not a cooperative adversary here. They're not going to let him skate
Yeah.
on everything else. And they're just going to, just as they wouldn't have about, when people online say, well, who cares if Pete Buttigieg is gay? Well, the Republicans will make it so that 150,000 people in 4 states might care enough about it to just stay home.
Yes. So I guess my blind spot is that I'm rooting for the center to hold, and I'm rooting against the extremists and the screamers who've basically taken over the whole village square, if you will. And this weekend looked to me like the ones who were convulsing with anti-Jewish rhetoric and pulling up 30-year-old essays where he used some language that was clear he didn't come out of the womb speaking exactly the same language, using exactly the approved vocabulary of a radical left wing, that they were going to cancel him. It pissed me off. I can't help but.
I don't blame. It's kind of like, it's like my friends and interlocutors online who are pissed off that, that kind of rules out Buttigieg for now. And it's like, well, you're right to be pissed off. But, we were talking about movie lines and we have similar tastes in movies. Let me just use something from Godfather 2. This is the business we've chosen. That it might suck. But the fact is that ticket balancing, I wrote about this a few weeks ago.
To push back on your point though, the fact that she went away from Shapiro and to Walz, it did feel personal. It wasn't business. If it was business, she would have chose Shapiro because he would have delivered. Do you think Shapiro can still deliver PA?
I don't think that. I'm going to disagree with you, Corey, that you're going on a big assumption that you picked Shapiro, Pennsylvania's a lock, and without Shapiro, Pennsylvania's gone. First of all, even Pennsylvanians might have reacted to a cynical choice that said, we're picking your governor because we expect you to deliver and show up.
That's fair. Yeah, I'm also making a lot of assumptions about why she ended up picking Walz instead of Shapiro. I'm assuming that she relented to the far left.
Look, you're looking at this through a very policy-oriented lens. I'm looking at it the way I think you have to look at elections now, which is vibes and images. And, remember, most people aren't as tuned into this as you are. And I think, it's hard not to like Tim Walz. It's just hard.
My brother's a trucker, and he said, yeah, but he could back a truck into a tight space.
He reminds me of a high school teacher I had, who was very partisan. The guy literally signed my yearbook, "Up the Irish and the Democrats." He was like an old school, Irish labor guy, and I was a young Republican at the time. I was a young, little right-wing snothead, thought I was cleverer than my teachers, but I loved to argue with Mr. Moran. He was great.
Yeah.
And I think Tim Walz is gonna kind of ping that in people, because I think, and this is speculation, I'm sitting up here in Rhode Island. I don't have any, inside dope on the Harris campaign. I suspect what she's trying to do is build team normal against team weirdo.
He's like the most normal guy ever. Football coach
of normal.
Yeah, absolutely.
His net worth is like 20 grand or something.
Yeah, you don't get rich as a high school teacher and a football coach,
right? or as a governor, for that matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be something. Of the 4 people, and think about this, of the 4 people in this national race, he is the only one who sounds like a normal person, because even Harris can give a very good speech. She can be very compelling on the stump. She's not great at extemporaneous speaking. She's gotten better at it. I mean, in 2020, I practically put down money. I mean, I didn't actually bet, but with friends, I made kind of, I said, never going to be Kamala Harris. She's too awkward off the stump. Can't, carry that. And she's gotten better at it, but she's still kind of stiff, and the hand gestures are a little off-putting. Trump, it makes no sense to anybody outside of his cult. And JD Vance tries to imitate Trump and just sounds like an inauthentic version of Trump.
Right. Yeah.
And so there is one guy who can just kind of walk in and say, boy, it sucks to have to work 60 hours to buy groceries, doesn't it? And it's not going to sound weird.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So let me just for listeners who aren't familiar, let me just give a little bit of background on Tim Walz. What I know about him, we already talked about. Served in the Army National Guard for 24 years after signing up as a 17-year-old. Earned a college
And as a
degree.
command, if I can just interject, I worked for the military for 25 years. He was a command master sergeant. That's a big deal. That is the most senior enlisted rank. That is like a narrower filter than like becoming a general for enlisted people. So it's not just that he was in the Army. It's that he attained a rank that, whether you love him or hate him in terms of politics, command master sergeant's a big deal.
Yeah,
So, sorry,
yeah. I've seen some other fellas, other individuals that pointed that out. That is in fact a big deal. I appreciate the fact that he earned a college degree from a state school where he grew up in Nebraska before he moving to Minnesota, becoming a high school teacher and a football coach. Both my parents worked in education their whole careers in the New York City system. My brother was a teacher and an administrator for a long time as well. He even won as a football coach, won his school's first state championship in '99. Worked on the 2004 John Kerry presidential campaign, which I guess piqued his interest in the possibility of running for office. Ran for Congress, defeated a longtime Republican incumbent for his U.S. House seat. And after serving in the House for 12 years, he became governor, and then in 2019, and then was reelected in the 2022 election. So one of the questions I had, I think it was I have it here, your July 24th essay, the manliness flip-flop. Your conclusion was real men serve their nation, their community, and their family. And unlike Trump and his elected Republic coterie, they do it without whining or demanding credit. So given Kamala's choice with Tim Walz, how does he stack up?
He's a guy. He's a guy I can respect.
Yeah, right.
Now he has, and again, we should keep pointing this out. He is not a middle of the road, kind of center right. I mean, he's a very liberal governor.
Yeah.
So she's not like balancing the ticket in terms of selling out core Democratic constituencies. She is balancing the ticket in that he's not a lawyer, didn't go to an elite school,
Yeah.
didn't spend his life in politics. I mean, one thing that you have to point out about people like Bashir and Shapiro is that their whole lives have been spent around politics, like right out of the birth canal practically.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that has become a liability for a lot of politicians. Walz can talk to people who work for a living and say, I know what it's like to work for a living. He doesn't have to just say, look, and again, I'm, whether he was the right choice, we'll see. I'm trying to kind of replicate what I think the thinking is in the Harris campaign, that when most politicians go and say, I feel your pain, the way Bill Clinton used to, because
Yeah.
Clinton sold that like few other politicians could. Other politicians now, they say, I know groceries are expensive. And I think most people look and say, when's the last time you really sweated a bag of groceries? Walz can do that and people go, okay.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah. To your point about a vibey election. So I was curious what your thoughts on J.D. Vance are. And I know the popular thing to say is it's a disaster, but
my thoughts on J.D. Vance not been written clearly.
No. They have. Obviously they have. And I read that piece you wrote. He's a fraud. But here's my question is he had some stumbles. It was arguably, once the RNC was done, it was clear that this guy was awkward and inauthentic, to say the least, right? Mm-hmm. But am I developing that impression because of how harsh the media criticism has been? Or is he objectively as much of a disaster as it seems to be?
No, he really is. I mean, I first wrote about him, all kidding aside, I first wrote about him almost 4 years ago. And I said, and I used a pretty harsh anatomical reference,
We got the explicit rating. So F bombs are you
Well,
know,
I called him an asshole.
yeah,
Because when you talk about when he gets like degenerate liberals and
yeah,
New York is the like dawn of the dead, and I just like this is just it's assholery. And what makes it particularly repugnant about Vance is that he knows better. He knows what a fraud he is. It's so transparent. I mean, the only person that I think gets into his um, kind of weight class for that level of fraudulence really has to be somebody like Elise Stefanik, Marco Rubio, that just turned 180 degrees around. And when you are that much of a fraud, when you are that inauthentic, when you are lying, Shapiro, going back to Shapiro had a great line, right? That you can't tell the truth if you're lying to yourself.
yeah.
Um, and that's what makes him so cringy because it's just he's play acting. Trump says stuff. Trump lies effortlessly. Trump says the craziest stuff as if it's like he's talking about the weather. Hey, and how about that Hannibal Lecter? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And people go, okay. Vance can't do that in part because there's a part of him that hasn't learned. Like it's like he's trying to sing a song that's very complicated and he only learned it recently, and he can't sing it with any conviction, and he can't even hit the right notes.
Hmm.
And so, no, it's not because of the media. He has always been this way. He's an inexperienced politician. He went right to the Senate, which is, usually a mistake for people that need a little more seasoning in politics. He has spent his time. The other problem here is that he has spent a lot of time around Silicon Valley guys with some really crackpot ideas. And when you live in that bubble of wealth, and among those kinds of weird guys, and I'm sorry, I know weird has become the motif, but I've been calling these people weird for 8 years.
Yeah.
You start thinking it's normal, and you don't realize how strange it sounds to normal people when you start talking about stuff that you've been talking about with Peter Thiel
You're right.
or Curtis Yarvin or people like that. You think it sounds perfectly normal. And then you get out there and you say it to an audience, and the audience, they all kind of, people kind of look at each other and go, well, okay, that was, in the words of George W. Bush, right? That was some weird shit.
That's right. That's right. My brother and I have been noticing that too. Some conversations that we're having, and I try to retain conversations with folks that are in different, what Renee DeRista called different bespoke realities than we are. And some of them are poking their heads out, now that things are, this last month has been like a decade worth of, if not a century's worth of news. So some of my buddies from high school that I graduated with, some folks that I went to church with, they're, piping up on a Facebook post or something. But they, in 4 or 5 cases, it's clear that they don't realize how fucking crazy they sound. How completely off the rails they sound because
among themselves, they don't think that's crazy.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So that's the problem, is that you only talk. I mean, part of, I think when I was a young conservative, one of the things that I thought was really healthy was that I went to a very liberal school in a very liberal city. I went to Boston University.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I was always having to argue with 5 people at once.
Right.
Which makes you combative
by virtue of the arguments, you're partly Jewish, actually.
No. Excuse me. I'm half Irish and half Greek, which, but I mean,
the guilt.
Arguing is just so deep in my DNA either way.
That's great.
But that it didn't let you fall into a bubble of just sitting around with a bunch of other really conservative college students and saying, yeah, tax rates should be 0. And old people should die, and or whatever it was.
Right.
We should nuke the Soviet Union tomorrow and shoot the commies in the ashes. You had to actually make your case to people all the time about what you believed, and I think it made you a better thinker. I think
right.
it made where you had to say, how would I really deal with that, you know, that objection, and I think the epistemic bubbles that everyone has retreated into, right and left, have made people just insane. They're not capable of stepping back now and saying, huh, okay, yeah, that's a good argument.
So,
They
yeah.
just can't.
So I want to go back to some of your writing from the night after the debate. And I'm curious to see how your thinking has evolved just in this last month and a half. The June 28th piece, you said Harris, even more than Biden, has serious electability problems. Her approval numbers are lower than Biden's, among the lowest of recent vice presidents. You can cavil that this is all the product of bias and racism and misogyny, but none of that matters on election day. If she can't win, she can't win. Worse, Biden abdicating in favor, and this is ultimately what happened, Biden abdicating in favor of Harris would convince many people, not all of them Trump supporters, that this was the plan all along, a way of giving the Democratic nomination and perhaps the White House to a woman seen by some as a radical leftist who ran a poor campaign in 2020 and can never have been nominated in her own right. So I'm assuming your assessment has evolved.
Well, Corey, I think it's really unfair that you're going to challenge me with stuff I actually said. I mean, wow. You went deep into the archives and you pulled up something I wrote a month ago, and I think that's a pretty cheap ambush.
Sorry, dude. I should have gave you the warning in advance.
Look, I did write it, and that was my concern. And I still wasn't sold at that moment. I was still willing to buy that Biden just had a bad night. And then he does the Stephanopoulos interview. And then he does the Lester Holt interview.
Yeah.
And then he does, every appearance. And I'm saying, it's this. I never called for him to step down. I said, listen, everybody needs to get past denial here that there is a problem. And I am not going to pick a Democrat out of this bunch because, I didn't want anybody getting piled on social media or anywhere else that my writing might be, to say, okay, so obviously this is what the never Trumpers wanted all along, because I was wrong about something very important. And the thing I was wrong about was the discipline with which the Democrats could make the transition from Biden to Harris.
Right. That's been the biggest surprise for me. The coalescing.
It surprised everybody, I think,
Yeah.
including a lot of Democrats.
Yeah.
And I think the way that it was handled, both by Biden and by Harris, was with a lot of grace. And, I understood that if Biden's going to step down, the vice president step down from the campaign, the vice president is the obvious choice. That's just how that goes.
Right.
And there wasn't time. The one thing I was really afraid of is just this insane mini primary where the Democrats just tear themselves apart. The other thing I was surprised by, I was wrong. There's two things I was wrong about. Harris has improved.
Yeah, she has.
She has improved.
It's clear.
There was a moment. This is the Harris moment that I remember from 2020, where because I remember my wife and I were kind of interested, like we didn't know a lot about, prosecutor, pretty good job on the Judiciary Committee, and I said, I'm kind of curious to see more of this person. And a reporter stops her and says, she's running against Biden at this point, and a reporter says, "Why are you a better choice for the nomination than Joe Biden?" And you could see her, all these gears turning in her head as she was like workshopping the answer in real time.
Yeah.
And she nodded and she said, I love America. You're like, okay, so stipulated.
Right.
That's not an answer to that question. And the rest of it was just a lot of garble. I love America, and Joe Biden loves America, and we all love America. And I'm like, oh, this is not going to work. And early on, back then, I took a lot of heat from people on the left because my argument was Joe Biden's the only guy that can beat Donald Trump.
Right.
And so that's the baggage that I took in with me all the way through Biden's term, going into this debate and saying, if if the person that's going to go up against Trump is the woman who said, if you ask her a pretty simple softball question and she kind of thinks for 10 minutes and then says, I love America, it's not going to happen. What I was surprised by is she's gotten more adept. She's clearly gotten more experienced. And the Democrats have decided for once not to commit mass fratricide.
Right. Right.
And so I was wrong. That's a long, windy way of saying, yes, I did write that. I was wrong.
Well, it's one of those. It's one of those things. Again, as part of the pro-democracy coalition, I'm happy to be wrong about some of this stuff. So
I say that all the time. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I mean, once it became clear that Biden was going to have to step down, I thought it's probably going to go to Harris. I really hope I'm wrong about. I think it's hard for Democrats to internalize this, but when I was a Republican, we counted on Democrats to act that way, of destroying each other and kind of missing the point, dropping the ball, and going for nominees that were too extreme and flying off on tangents about stuff that most Americans just don't care about. I mean, the Democrats lost a lot. That situation I was talking about in 2016 happened because the Democrats lost a lot of really winnable elections. Just through I would argue, sheer political malpractice. And because Democratic voters are just not reliable voters. They just don't show up regularly enough. Remember, Republican voters, if you say that there's an election for dog catcher, they all show up.
Right.
And so in all this, yes, my fervent prayer, to the universe was, please don't be Democrats about this. Please let me be wrong about this. And I think that's what happened. And I think we actually have we certainly have a healthier presidential contest than we were heading into a month ago.
Okay. So I feel like I only have one or two questions left here because I want to get you out on time. One of the questions I usually ask, the TP&R question, which is how can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? But there are sub questions of that. For example, you've been critical of how the media has been covering Trump's psychopathy, for lack of a better word. Are there certain outlets or individual journalists that you think do a better job of this than others? And a related question, what recommendations do you have for regular guys like me in terms of the way we consume our news and analysis?
Well, thank you for throwing me the easy softball to tell people to subscribe to The Atlantic.
I told Sammy that I do my best to give a softball like that.
Say, Tom, is there a magazine? Can you think of one perhaps? Yes, I can.
Me.
I think the key is to, the New York Times is getting a lot of static these days for some really bad headlines and, cancer cure found. This is why it's bad for Joe Biden, right?
Yeah.
But I would encourage people that even in the papers of record that they're dumping on, the Post, the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc., read beyond the headline. The stories, there are good reporters working at all of these places, and the stories are actually pretty textured. One of the most disheartening things I can remember, I was on a panel probably about 5 or 6 years ago with Heather Cox Richardson and Dan Baltz. And oh no, I'm sorry, I don't think Heather was there. It was Kathleen Jamison and Dan Baltz. And Dan Baltz, the Washington Post. And someone said, well, you could help us readers out by writing more explainers. And Baltz very calmly, without missing a beat, said, we do write them. You won't read them. So it's not a matter of what, it's kind of like saying, if I go to a restaurant, how can I eat better? Well, you can order a salad instead of the mozzarella sticks. There's a start.
Yeah.
It's not that you have to go to a different restaurant. It's that you can order better things. The equivalent of that is, read the entire stories and have a balanced diet. I think this is much more advice for the right than the left, because I think there's much more informational that there's much more diversity of information outside of, Fox and the New York Post and, the right-wing media ecosystem. That's a very closed system. So if you're one of the folks, if you're hearing this and you want to know what to do, stop, just, add one more thing to your diet. Get away from Fox, get away from OAN. I know you're not going to do it, but that's my advice. And so it's not just a matter of where to go. It's read carefully. And also, and this is maybe the best advice I can give, because I've been giving this piece of advice ever since I wrote The Death of Expertise, a fine book, which is now in its second edition, by the way.
I didn't even get to any of my, I just read the revised edition, by the way.
Figured I'd just get ahead of you on that one.
Yeah.
But I tell people, you don't need to take in news all day long. It burns your brain out. Even I'm paid to write about this stuff, and I don't watch that much news. If you read one or two newspapers in the morning, if you can find your online, I live in a small town in Rhode Island. We have an online local paper. You can read that. If you read one national newspaper and one local or regional paper, you're fine every day. You don't need to be watching 6 hours of news coverage. Someone the other day said, well, I need to go to work, but I don't want to leave, and because they're going to announce the vice presidential candidate. And I'm like, it'll
okay. Still be there when you get back.
This doesn't rely on you.
Yeah.
You can find out after you get home. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the other thing. People need to treat news like food, make healthy choices, and consume in moderation.
No, there's no time for you to ask questions of me, and I'm almost afraid. I'll give you one Jeopardy question. I'll give you one impression, and if you guess if you know which movie I'm referring to, dinner's on me next time I visit Rhode Island.
Okay.
Here's the one. Life goes on. A man become preeminent. He's expected to have enthusiasms. What movie are we talking about?
My enthusiasm is baseball.
Baseball. That's right.
And that is, of course, Robert De Niro as Al Capone in The Untouchables.
Bingo. Dinner's on me next time I visit. So before we go, how can we be sure to read everything you're writing at The Atlantic and all the great work that you're doing?
Subscribe to The Daily, which is our daily newsletter. It's free. And you can read every story. You can read the daily, each story in the daily every day for free. So if you're on a budget, but of course you need to subscribe to The Atlantic because it's money well spent for your edification and enjoyment.
Yeah.
Other than that, you can find me at Radio Free Tom on all the platforms, Blue Sky, Threads, formerly Twitter.
Yeah.
And I'm around.
Yeah. That newsletter is fantastic. I love your pieces, of course, but I also like the links to other stories in the newsletter. Good stuff. Really appreciate this, Tom. I've been wanting to talk to you literally for years, so I'm so glad we got a chance to do this.
And so nice to be able to have a chance to chat, Corey. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Let me let you go. I'll do my outro and get to write and get to your deadline.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks so much. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show, write that review, write it. The reviews really do help. And now you can join in the conversation on Patreon. It's patreon.com/politicsandreligion, patreon.com/politicsandreligion. Check it out, subscribe, get some TPNR swag. Really excited about that. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.